Hello, I'm Gary Marchant, Lincoln Professor of Emerging Technologies, Law and Ethics, and also a Regents Professor and Professor of Law at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law and Faculty Director of our Center for Law, Science, and Innovation. Today I'm going to talk to you about should human germline gene editing be permitted? So for decades, we've looked at this question of should we modify the human germline when we get the capability to do so. This was just sort of a theoretical question until recently because we couldn't really do it. But there was a very broad consensus that we should not cross this barrier. We should not cross the germline and edit or change the genome of future generations. Now all of a sudden, with this new technology called CRISPR, which is a very effective, cheap, and easy to use technology to modify the genome of any organism, including humans, suddenly this theoretical possibility becomes real. We're not there yet, but we're very close to being able to have probably safe ways to genetically alter or genetically edit the human germline. Now raising the question again in a much more practical and immediate sense, should we actually do it? Now that we may have the capability to do this in the next few years, should we do that? And again, there's a strong sentiment out there that we should not edit the human germline, that should be sacrosanct and we should not cross that line. Nevertheless, people are starting to do it as a research project of editing human embryos and showing that it is feasible to do that. And again, although a lot of more safety testing is needed to actually put this into practice, we can now see that in the next few years, it may be possible to safely edit human germline and future generations. Therefore, squarely raising now the question, now that we can do it, should we do it? And again, it sort of will depend, I think, and my bottom line conclusion here is that your opinion on whether we should do this depends on your confidence in the legal system. So that doesn't maybe seem obviously clear, so let me explain why I think it comes down to that key question. So I was a member of the National Academy of Sciences, which was asked to look at this question a couple years ago. We put out a report in February 2017 on human genome editing. This report is free, available online. And among other things, we were asked to address whether or not we should go forward with this germline gene editing. And in looking at the question of gene editing, there had been long time agreement that somatic therapy, of basically treating diseases in an existing human, was ethically okay to do. We need to be sure it's safe and so on, but there wasn't huge ethical objections. The three boxes that were controversial: should we use enhancement of an existing person or a future person, that's a germline, and should we do therapy of the germline of a future person? Those were questions that had really not been resolved one way or the other. And our committee looked at a lot of evidence, listened to a lot of people, and we came to the conclusion that no, we shouldn't use enhancement in either somatic or germline contexts. But the place that was most controversial of our report is we said maybe we should be allowed to go forward with some germline gene therapy, some gene editing of future generations in certain contexts. And this was the really sort of controversial, novel conclusion of this report because it went against this long-standing consensus that we basically should not cross that threshold. Why did we come to that conclusion? Well, first of all, we recognize there's a lot of real concerns about editing future humans. One is that there could be risks that we don't see for many generations when it's too late. It may be very hard to track people who didn't consent to this procedure to know if in fact there's those risks. It basically is a new way of intervening in what a lot of people think is sort of playing God, of basically trying to design future kids and babies in ways that maybe we shouldn't do. And then there's also concern that maybe it suggests that somehow people who are born with different types of genetic conditions are somehow lesser because we are trying to change future people who have the same genetic condition. So there's a lot of very well-established arguments against gene editing and of the germline, and we certainly understood those arguments and agreed with them in large extent, that these are important factors, important arguments. But what really drove us to maybe change what had been the consensus was the fact that there would be some people who would really benefit from this. So first of all, most people who have a genetic condition in their family tree can avoid having a baby with that without having to use germline gene editing. They can use things like pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to select healthy embryos and implant them selectively. So there are ways that most people who would be at risk of a genetic disease don't have to do this genome editing. And in fact, the genome editing would be much more difficult to do than just the selection process. The selection process would be sort of an initial step in genome editing, so it makes sense just to do that in most cases. But there will be a few people, a few families where that would not be possible. For example, they may be homozygous for the Huntington's disease variant. This is a dominant disease, and maybe one of the parents has 2 copies of that gene. So they can't possibly have a healthy, non-affected embryo. Or maybe it's a couple who both have cystic fibrosis. In that case, they have all their copies of the gene, have the disease, and all their offspring will also have the disease. Or maybe they, for various reasons, they couldn't produce very many embryos for various different kinds of health problems, and they could only produce 1 or 2 embryos, and they happen to have that condition. Or maybe they don't agree with, they take a pro-life point of view and they don't agree with discarding embryos that have the condition, and so want to try to save those embryos. These are all possibilities that are there. They're at a very low percentage of the population, but for those people, the only way they can have their own children is by using this genome editing. And so one argument could be, well, they could use other mechanisms to reproduce. They could adopt. They could use other techniques like donor gametes to try and have healthy babies. The reality is, though, and the literature supports this, is that for many people, having a biological child is an overwhelmingly important factor. I personally have had a child naturally and one by adoption. I see no difference between them. They seem to be just as much my children as each other. There's no need necessarily to have my own biological children, in my view, but that's not the view of many people. Many people have the view that they have to and want to have a biological child. And the question is, if there is a safe procedure for them to do that, who is anybody to say they can't do that? What right do we have as academics or as government officials or whoever as doctors to say to these families, I'm sorry, we think these broader ethical concerns override your biological interest and need to have your own biological children. And furthermore, there's literature showing that even if you tell people they're at risk and don't give them any other options, they will take the risk of having very seriously affected children with horrible genetic diseases out of this, again, this drive to have their own biological children. So in the end, for us on the committee, we found that this need of some people to have their own biological children who could maybe do it in a safe way with this technology, but couldn't do it in any other way, that would override some of these broader concerns if we could limit this procedure to just those people. So what we basically recommended is a number of conditions on allowing this to go forward. One is the absence of reasonable alternatives, but the other one, very importantly, as well as some others I won't get into, was that it would only be to basically restore a healthy genotype, with people who have a known genetic disease gene, to be able to put a healthy copy of that gene in. So as we said, healthy babies, not designer babies. This would not be used to add in new traits or add things that other people don't have. It would simply be to allow these children to be up at the same level as the rest of us. Now, the big weakness of this argument is the slippery slope. That if we allow this procedure to go forward and basically, show it is feasible for these families that have these serious genetic conditions, and this is the only way they can produce healthy babies, and if we go down that road, what is to stop other families from using this for more problematic uses of things like enhancement, of adding in new traits, and so on, by the slippery slope argument? And this was our major concern with allowing just these few cases to go forward, is that it opens the door to the slippery slope. And so this then comes to the key question of law, because almost everyone agrees that if we were to just have unrestricted germline editing of future children, that this would not be a desirable world, that we'd be creating all kinds of selections and pressures and even possible risks that none of us would probably want to support. So this idea of allowing everybody to just a wide open, unrestricted germline editing would be unacceptable. And so how can we prevent ourselves from going down that road? The only way is by legally prohibiting that. And so now it comes to this key question then, is can law prevent us from sliding down the slippery slope? Because I think if we really could limit it to just these few families, I think very few people would have objections to allowing these families to have healthy children using this technique. The concern is that it will go much broader. And the only thing stopping us from going much broader would be legal prevention. And the question is, can we trust, Can we believe that we can create legal rules to stop us from sliding down that slippery slope? And that, to me, is where the debate ends up. Personally, I believe we can do that. I think the legal system can put in place suitable regulations to stop it, but it won't be easy. We have all kinds of problems of medical tourism, of other countries, of people going around the rules. But in the end, I do think it is worth taking that small risk for the benefit of allowing these families to have healthy children. But others, disagree, and that's where the key ethical issue comes down, is again, do we believe law can constrain and channel this technology into these beneficial uses without crossing the line into these more ethically objectionable ones? So that's the bottom line question, and it's one that I think we'll have to debate for many years coming forward. Thank you.